Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest in our Valuing Nature Natural Capital webinar series. We'll start the webinar now. I'll hand over shortly to our speakers today, who are going to be Victoria Janes-Bassett and Jess Davies, speaking about their report on soil natural capital valuation in agri-food businesses. But before we do that, I'd just like to welcome you on behalf of the Valuing Nature programme and give you a brief introduction to the Valuing Nature programme and tell you a little bit about what we've been doing. My name is Anita Weatherby. I'm based at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and my colleague Victoria Barlow. Together, the two of us will be hosting this webinar today. So I'm going to give a brief introduction, then I'll hand over to our speaker. It's Victoria Janes-Bassett who's going to be speaking today. Then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions that Victoria and Jess will respond to between them. So please do type in any questions you think of as we go along. And of course, at the end of the webinar, you'll have a chance to type those questions in. There's a question box on your webinar interface, and hopefully you can see where to put those questions in. So the Valuing Nature programme is a 5-year investment from a number of different research councils and DEFRA. It's a £7 million programme, and it's thinking about how we make decisions about the natural environment. How do we take into account the different values for nature from different academic and user perspectives? So the summary there is to better understand and represent the complexities of the natural environment in valuation analyses, and to consider the wider societal and cultural value of ecosystem services. And you can see the funders' logos at the bottom there. We have the Natural Environment Research Council, the Arts and Humanities, Economic and Social Science, and Biological and Bioscience Research Councils, as well as DEFRA. And our purpose in coordinating this programme is to try and build capability to work across those different discipline areas to improve decision making about the natural environment. There are 3 goals under the programme, and the first is where we come in. We're running a programme coordination team to try and build this Valuing Nature network. So to build capability across those different discipline areas, to bring researchers together with users in the world of business, policy making and practice. And we've run a series of events and activities over the last few years with that aim in mind. So we have an annual conference. We've run a series of placements where researchers can go and work in a different discipline area for 3 months or go and work in a different applied area. We have a series of business engagement activities, including a business impact school and a regular business interest group to try and help researchers understand business interests in this area. And we've produced a series of demystifying publications to try and take some of the concepts involved to a broader audience. So we have, for example, publications called Demystifying Economic Valuation and Demystifying Health, which thinks about different concepts of physical and mental health and well-being and how the natural environment can influence those. There are also 2 sets of research projects under the programme. The first 4 research projects are focused on the role of the natural environment in human health and well-being. How do we take into account different values in making decisions about how we manage the natural environment for human health and well-being? And there are 3 projects looking at what we've called ecosystem stocks and tipping points. So again, that's about understanding values in terms of the relationships between the stocks of ecosystems, the services that come from those ecosystems, and the benefits to humans, and thinking about how we manage those ecosystem stocks in order to avoid abrupt and damaging change in the delivery of benefits, so those tipping points there. We've built the network up over the last few years. We now have over 2,000 members of the Valuing Nature network. If you haven't joined already, please do go to the website and sign up. That way you'll get newsletters and notifications about opportunities that are coming up through the network. And we have about 4,000 followers on Valuing Nature on Twitter as well. So that's another great way of keeping in touch with the network activities. One of the major concepts under the idea of valuing nature is natural capital. I'm looking at this a couple of years ago. We recognised that although there was a lot of discussion about natural capital and a lot of ambition from policy and practice to put natural capital ideas into practice, linking up the research understanding to those users' needs, there was a bit of a gap in that kind of area. So we ran a call to commission a series of reports in this area. to summarise the current state of knowledge for users and to identify where the research issues and research gaps for future needs were. So there were 5 successful bids into that call. Those reports are now published and available on our website, and we now have the series of webinars to take the findings of those reports to a wider audience. So you can see we're at number 4 of the webinar series today. We're going to hear from Victoria and Jess in a moment about soil, natural capital and agri-food businesses. And then next week we have the final webinar in the series from Rose Pritchard, where we'll hear about monetary natural capital assessment in the private sector. So please do sign up for that if you're interested. And as I said, all of these reports are available for download from our website. So please do go and do that. So with no further ado, I believe Victoria is going to speak to the report first of all, and then we'll have questions from both Victoria and Jess. Just a reminder that we will have time for questions at the end, so please do type in those questions as we go along, and it will help us if you can just use simple language and spell out any acronyms in your questions as you go, so we can make sure we understand your questions correctly. Okay, with no further ado then, I'll hand over to Victoria.
Hello. Just check. Okay, hopefully you can hear me. Thank you for attending the webinar. So yes, I'm going to talk to you about our natural capital synthesis report, which looks at soil natural capital and natural capital valuation within an agri-food business. So this project was funded by the Valuing Nature team, and we worked in partnership with an international agri-business called Olam. So Olam work from farm to shelf in a range of products, particularly focusing on nuts, cocoa, coffee, and edible spices. The project, it was, as Anita said, it was a short synthesis report. So we worked on this from around February to the end of March last year. Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to go to the next slide. So yeah, the report, the aims of the report was to summarise the state of knowledge surrounding natural capital that's relevant to the agri-food sector, and how agri-food businesses can apply natural capital within their business, and then identify key gaps, scientific knowledge and modelling tools that we can address to help further research and collaboration and application of natural capital within these businesses. And as Anita said, we've published a report for soil natural capital valuation in agribusiness, which is available on the Valuing Nature website. So to give you an outline of the project and what we did, we started initially with some scoping meetings with Olam. This was to understand the business needs, what are business requirements for natural capital, and what are the opportunities for natural capital within the business. We then conducted a literature review looking at sort of the academic literature around natural capital and soil natural capital evaluation, and then looked at the currently existing frameworks, and with further discussion with Olam and reviewing the business needs, we formulated a framework that met the business needs whilst sort of taking bits of existing frameworks and meeting the business requirements. We then did what we've termed evidence chain mapping, which was looking at how we can implement this framework and where the gaps are in terms of scientific understanding and tools for us to be able to apply natural capital with an agribusiness setting, and developed a roadmap for soil natural capital research. So you may be aware of the value of soil, but just to talk a bit about soils and in terms of ecosystem services before I go into what we did in the report. So soils are hugely valuable, and this is obviously the most apparent or obvious benefit we get from soils is in terms of food production. Soils provide the vast majority, over 95% of the food we eat, but soils also provide a huge range of other ecosystem services, some of which are less apparent and sometimes overlooked, one of them being water storage. So soils play a huge role in providing resilience to drought and flood events through the storage of water, but they also impact on water quality through the filtering of contaminants and heavy metals and pollutants. They also play a huge role in climate regulation. So soils are the largest terrestrial store, or the largest store of organic carbon. They contain about 80% of the terrestrial carbon and have about 3 times the amount of carbon compared to the atmosphere. So they have this huge potential to regulate our climate related to greenhouse gas emissions, particularly carbon dioxide. And biodiversity, soils contain around 25% of the Earth's biodiversity. The handful of soil contains around the similar number of organisms to people on Earth. So they provide this huge habitat, not just above ground, but also below ground for a wide range of biodiversity. And nutrient cycling, as I mentioned, in relation to carbon and climate regulation, but soils are also involved in nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, which is also further linked to climate regulation and a range of other ecosystem services that soils provide. But our soils are under threat. So there's a range of soil issues which I just wanted to mention here. So erosion, so where we lose the soil, particularly in agricultural areas where we see natural vegetation is removed, leaving the soils more susceptible to the erosive impact of rainfall, and we lose soils. And often erosion can occur on orders of magnitude much greater than soil formation. Soil formation is quite a slow process, occurring over centuries to millennia, and often where we see significant erosion, this is happening much faster than we can replenish the soil. Pollution, so through agricultural practices and urbanization, we're seeing changes to the soil chemistry through additions of fertilizers and pesticides, and atmospheric deposition of pollutants. And this changes the soil chemistry and can have implications for water quality and the biodiversity in the soil. Soil compaction is another issue. A natural soil would have lots of pore spaces, which allows water to infiltrate, provides gaseous exchange for plant roots. But when we have soil compaction through either urbanization or use of heavy machinery over the soil, this reduces those pore spaces in the soil, reducing soil water storage, and can also then accelerate erosional processes. Salinization is another issue where we see a buildup of salts in the soil. This often occurs where you have irrigated lands, where land is irrigated with water containing salts, and as the water evaporates, it leaves the salt behind, and over time this accumulates. So these kind of problems soil issues lead to soil degradation, which ultimately reduce the natural functioning of the soil and reduce the ability of the soil to provide a range of ecosystem services. And just to give you an idea of the magnitude of soil degradation, agricultural soils make up around a third of terrestrial lands. Agricultural is about a third of terrestrial land use, and 50% of agricultural soils are classified as moderately or severely degraded, and that the area of degraded soils is increasing at a rate of around 12 million hectares a year, which is about the size of Bulgaria. So this is a really urgent and significant issue. So next, I just wanted to mention about businesses and soils. So this figure's taken from a paper which Jess published a couple of years ago, and it's to highlight the importance of soil to businesses. So whilst here we've particularly been working with an agribusiness, soils are actually relevant to a whole range of businesses. Any business that has animal or plant products anywhere in their supply chain is ultimately dependent on soils, and what we're trying to do here is make highlight the dependency of businesses upon the natural environment, and in particular soils. And there was an interesting statistic in that paper that in 2015, the Kering Group, which is a fashion brand, which is the parent company of brands like Puma and Gucci, in their sustainability reporting, they highlighted that the majority of their environmental impacts were associated with the production of raw materials, and land use change is the biggest contributor to this. And the cost of environmental damage caused by land use change was estimated by this company at 191 million euros per year. Obviously, the cost of soil degradation is kind of hidden within that figure. So what we wanted to do with this natural capital approach was kind of disentangle soil degradation from those kinds of figures. So this table is just to illustrate the some previous studies that have quantified the value of soil ecosystem services in a range of different land uses. And really here I just wanted to highlight that soil ecosystem services can have significant value. So I've divided this up into the 4 different ecosystem services. So supporting services which are necessary for the production of all of the services, but provide indirect benefits to humans. So I've actually termed these supporting processes here, similar to Dominati, and I've actually grayed this out and not put a value because there's the idea is that if you're accounting for supporting processes and other ecosystem services, that you can lead to double accounting. So from here on, I'll refer to those as supporting processes rather than services. Then regulating services which provide a regulation of environmental characteristics like climate and flood regulation and pests and diseases. Provisioning services which provide products from which society benefits, like food and water, and then cultural services which provide non-material benefits from the environment, so things like recreation and aesthetic values. And cultural services, largely in the literature, have are rather underrepresented because they're quite hard often to quantify and value. So yeah, this table is a range of values, so it really just highlights the magnitude of soil ecosystem service value, but also I should note that this table I've just put one value for each of these things. There's quite a lot of uncertainty around these values often, and those values can vary considerably both spatially and temporally, but also on land use and situation. So moving on to natural capital and business and the report. So one of the first things we did was discussing with Olam and to discuss what were the main benefits that a business could receive in taking a natural capital approach, and we sort of drew out these 5 key benefits for businesses. The first was to evaluate business risk and resilience. So as I said, soils underpin many business supply chains, and by taking a natural capital approach, businesses can really understand their dependency on soils or the environment, and understand their exposure to risks and how they can increase their resilience to these risks. The second one is reducing costs. So, and using a natural capital approach, we can provide a business case for a change of practice. So in relation to soils, this might be looking at win-wins that provide more sustainable soil management practices, but also maybe reduce costs in terms of fertilizer use or irrigation. The third, increased value. So a natural capital approach can increase value of the land by providing a more productive land, but also in terms of the products that the business is making in a market where sustainability is becoming increasingly important to consumers. Those final end products from the business can have increased value. Fourthly, co-benefits. So by taking natural capital approach and having a more sustainable environmental business, there can be benefits both within the business, as we said, about reducing costs, but also to the wider community. And this is linked to ecosystem services and sustainable practices can provide both public and private benefits, which I'll talk more about in a moment. And then stewardship is the final one we've brought up here. So decision making within a business that maintains soil health, demonstrates responsible businesses, and can help maintain license to operate. But ultimately, from all these things we discussed with Olam, it's key. It's obvious that natural capital and ecosystem services is key to ensuring that the business has a long-term sustainable business model. So then we discussed with Olam what would be the business requirements of a natural capital accounting framework. And there were sort of 3 key areas that we would like to bring out here. So the first is to understand the risk within the business. So as I said, that a natural capital approach can highlight the dependencies on the environment and understand risks and resilience. So Olam told us that they wanted to understand not just the value of or understand current natural capital assets, but understand how they were changing and what the implications of that would be. So one of the things a framework would need to be able to do this is to capture the whole pathway. And what I mean by that is we understand not just the ecosystem services and the benefits these provide, but we also link that to the natural capital assets from which those ecosystem services are derived, but also then understand the supporting processes and the drivers that drive change in those natural capital stocks, so we can predict or understand future change to those natural capital stocks and ecosystem service provision. The next thing was to build a strong business case, and to do this we need to consider a whole range of soil benefits and soil ecosystem services rather than just focusing only on crop productivity. So one way we looked at this with OLAM was to consider ecosystem services across 3 priority areas, and these were termed food production, soil carbon storage and water regulation, and in that way we could evaluate a wider range of soil ecosystem services. And the final thing was differentiating between benefits. So I mentioned just briefly about recognising both private and public benefits and acknowledging that those public benefits can actually have private value to the business. So the next thing we did was sort of reviewing the literature, and there's quite a lot of literature out there on soil natural capital, and what we were doing was trying to see what existing frameworks met the business needs that we'd sort of discussed with OLAM. So the first thing that we noticed was, whilst there are quite a lot of natural capital soil ecosystem service frameworks, a lot of them focus on ecosystem services and don't necessarily all link to the natural capital assets from which those ecosystem services are derived. And from discussions with OLAM, that was something that we really needed to do to be able to understand current value and how future ecosystem service provision might change. There were also few frameworks that met all of the criteria that we discussed with OLAM for maximising a natural capital approach, and fewer that have been applied and quantified within agricultural contexts. I've put a couple of references at the bottom there because there are some frameworks that do closely meet these requirements and that have provided quantifications. So there are some key papers that you might want to refer to if you want to read more about this. So the next thing was to develop a framework for business. So this is what I was saying I've termed a full pathway. So we have ecosystem services that provide benefits to humans, and they are derived from natural capital stocks. But those natural capital stocks are supported and maintained by supporting processes operating. So in soil systems, these are things like nutrient cycling, soil formation processes, and soil hydrology. And those processes are also affected by drivers, and these are both anthropogenic and natural drivers, so things like land management, climate and geology. So we need to understand this whole pathway so we can understand both current and future stocks of natural capital, and hence understand current and future ecosystem service provision. As I mentioned, we need to make sure we consider a wider range of soil ecosystem services, so not just focusing on crop productivity, but looking at the 3 priority areas of crop productivity, carbon storage and water regulation. So these were the evidence chains that I mentioned previously. So we created an evidence chain like this for carbon storage, food productivity and water regulation, and these can be found in the reports on the Valuing Nature website, but here I'm just going to talk about this one for carbon. So natural capital stocks can be termed similarly to soil properties. So in terms of carbon storage, soil properties that have a key influence on that natural capital stock are organic carbon contents and soil depths. And the ecosystem service that this provides is regulation of greenhouse gases, and the benefit being climate regulation. And we can put a market value on that using carbon pricing if you wished. The supporting processes that can influence those stocks of soil carbon storage include things like the nutrient cycling, soil biological activity and soil formation, and then the drivers influencing those processes including climate, geology and land use and management. So to be able to quantify this evidence chain, we need a combination of data to understand current natural capital stocks, but we also need modelling tools to be able to quantify future natural capital stocks and ecosystem service provision. So one of the key evidence gaps that we discovered that was common across each of these three priority areas was that whilst we have models of each of these supporting processes, and we can simulate natural capital stocks, a range of natural capital stocks, the models of supporting processes are often developed in disciplinary silos, and these models aren't integrated. So, for instance, key feedback mechanisms and interactions between processes often aren't represented within these models. So, one of the key scientific gaps that we discovered through this process was that there was a need for integrated models to inform decision making, so that we can use these models to simulate a range of ecosystem services rather than just ecosystem services related to particular benefits like food provision or water regulation, so we can understand trade-offs within the system and more fully inform land use management and decision making. So in terms of science understanding, as I've mentioned the gaps that we have here, and there's a few more that we've mentioned in the report, but I think it's really important to note there are gaps. You know, we do need more data, we do need more models, but we do already have quite a lot, and we know enough to get started and make quantifications, whilst it's important to recognise the uncertainty and limitations of those quantifications. We can do that. We do need to consider the wider range of soil ecosystem services and benefits, and there is a need to represent dynamic soil stocks and the integration of these processes. And one of the key needs for agribusiness and land use and management is the representation of land management options, so we can evaluate and inform decision making. But we also need to bridge the science business gap. We need closer partnership between science and business to understand the business needs and help application of the science research, and more funding mechanisms that allow this kind of collaboration and co-creation. So I've just highlighted the Sustainable Development Goals at the bottom there. I mean, you could link soils as being important to all of the Sustainable Development Goals, but I've put a few key ones there and highlighted this partnerships for the goals, because I think this collaboration between business and science is key to achieving this goal. So that's it. Thank you very much for joining the webinar. And yes, our full report's available on the Valuing Nature website, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hello, this is Victoria here. Thank you, Victoria. That was a really, really thought-provoking presentation. Thank you very much. So we have got some questions already, and hopefully some more will come in as we stimulate people's minds with the first few. So these are questions to Victoria and Jess, just so everybody remembers that Jess is there too at the moment.
Yes, she'll take all the tricky questions.
She's going to take the tricky. Fantastic.
That's not true.
Okay, so the first question is from Scott Park, and he'd like to know, do you think the table of values could be used in assisting the creation of future policy for the new ELMS scheme, which are due to be the replacement of direct payments for farmers once we leave the EU?
I think the ultimate goal would be, yes, that this kind of process could inform that. However, I wouldn't take that table. So in that table, I should put a disclaimer really, that those are just, I've just put up one value for each of those services, and those values can be hugely variable, both in time and space, and what land use you're looking at. They're quite situational. So I think this kind of approach and those kind of values that you would derive could be used for that, but not necessarily the values in that table. I think that's...
Yeah, I would agree.
Sorry, just to clarify, Scott has clarified his acronym there, which stands for Environment Land Management Scheme, which I assume you both knew, but sorry.
Yes, we knew Environmental Land Management Scheme. Soils are. It's great that soils are being, put so prominently amongst the considerations for the ALMS. And I think, as Victoria says, this piece of work it shows that valuation can be done, but that table is just an illustration. And I guess what it does, it demonstrates that there's a wide range of values that can be derived from soils. And whilst the biomass production one might be the largest in and of itself, the other services, they add up eventually. And, you do get an important component of public benefit as well as private benefit from soils. So I guess the work would be to develop something specific that was appropriate to elms, but the message is that this has been done in other contexts and can be done.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question from Paola Ovando. The effect of unsustainable soil management practices are frequently suffered by downstream users, in brackets activities. This implies the accounting approach need to transcend the agribusiness boundaries. Is this something that you are considering?
So yeah, I guess we've only really touched on this here in terms of public and private benefit, and in terms of downstream consequences of management practices. If land managers were supposed to put practices in place that would reduce those downstream effects, that's a public benefit. There could also be private value to that, and like we were saying, in terms of looking at responsible business practice and licenses to operate, there's definitely private value in that, which is quite obvious. But then I think, linking back to the previous question, I think it's these kinds of things and using this kind of approach that could link into sort of wider land management policies that could sort of promote that kind of downstream caring, as it were. I think, do you want to add to that? That was a no. So yeah, okay. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I have a question from Adrian Fabre. Hello, my question is about the future gaps you mentioned. You said that it's important to have links between academic and business sectors, but does this also consider governmental and policy-making stakeholders?
Yes, it does. And sorry, I should have said that. So obviously in this report, we were focusing on agribusiness, but absolutely in terms of decision making, academia and science needs to collaborate with the decision makers at large, which isn't just businesses, smaller stakeholders and at a large scale policy makers and government and international level. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and just to add to that, perhaps, I think soil's a really interesting case where it becomes even more relevant to have public and private partnership, and this is something that's come very strongly through conversations I've been having with a wider set of multinational businesses through the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, thinking about soil health more generally, and how businesses can invest in soil health. And to enable that to happen, it does need governmental policy. It needs the partnership of the public sector as well as private, because soil is this thing that's delivering these both private and public goods. And we've had a system that for a long time where we've only considered the private good, and that has led to degradation. So the case for action here and for creating value in these systems, it needs to be bridged across public and private, and it needs those actors engaged together then, really. And whilst this report is focused on the private sector, I think beyond this, we do need to be thinking about, well, how can we innovate on private and public partnership to deliver soil sustainability and the value that delivers. I'd be interested if people have examples and ideas about this also. I guess we've seen some innovation in the finance sector around public and private funds for funding innovation in land management. But what could we do in a UK context specifically would be really interesting to me.
Thank you, Jess, and thank you for your question, Adrian. Next question is from Heather Webb. What's the best approach to assigning a monetary value to an ecosystem service, i.e. how do you make the leap in the evidence tree in the C example from carbon storage to climate regulation to cash, money?
That's a good question. I was hoping Jess would say that one. Yeah, pushing a monetary value is, we could have a whole other webinar discussion on that. And there was an interesting talk at the Valuing Nature, the keynote talk by Ian Hodge on that. So in terms of putting a value on it, so using the example of carbon, I mean, in our example of the evidence chain, I used the example of using the market values for carbon. I think the first thing is to, before we talk about monetary values, we need to be looking at how we are quantifying the stocks and the ecosystem services in the process. So in the first place, so looking at the data and looking at the models and coming up with an uncertainty range, I think is really important for that, because when we're putting something as almost as sort of as finite as a value, I think it's important to communicate how certain we are in that value, and to be certain in that value, we've got to be certain in the stock value that we're deriving it from. So that would be my first thought would be is, yeah, in terms of the data and the models required to come to that value, and then coming up with a range of the scientific value before we go with the monetary value. I'm not sure how well that answers your question. I think Jess might add something.
I was just going to add that Valuing Nature programme has a lovely paper on demystifying economic valuation that might be useful in answering that question. You know, the means for moving to monetary valuation are discussed in there in more general terms, and they apply here also.
Okay, thank you very much. And so we've got a question from Joe Leaper now, which is following on from that theme, actually. Do you have an idea of how the total value of soil natural capital relates to other types of natural capital?
My immediate answer would be no, but I think it would be quite large. So there was a paper by Constanza that sort of was looking at putting a value on the environment some time ago, and I know that there's been a revision to that paper, but often in these papers that value the environment broadly, soils, as I sort of said at the beginning, that a lot of the ecosystem services that soils provide are not maybe providing direct benefit, or they're sort of included within other environmental processes. So the value of soils often is not fully accounted for in those, because it's hidden within other costs. Quite similarly to, as I said, about the sustainability report from Kerrig and that cost of land use change, but the cost of soil degradation is hidden within that. And I think the values that exist that could give you those kind of grand figures probably often hide soil a bit too much. So I wouldn't want to say for definite what the value is in comparison to other sources of natural capital, but it would be big.
Okay, great, thank you. So a question from Alessandro Germana. I understand that the focus is business here, but how do you propose to deal with trade-offs between business activities and public goods? The idea of paying business to avoid externalities seems to allocate to them a right to degrade.
Tricky question. So I suppose what we're trying to highlight here is by certain practices and allowing the soils to degrade, you lose out on a range of ecosystem services, and we're trying to highlight the value of those other services. So whilst you know, doing a practice that might provide you a greater crop productivity and the obvious benefit in terms of crop production you would mean maybe as a business you might continue to do that practice, but if you consider then the lost value in other things like carbon storage and water storage, the increased cost of irrigation, the increased cost of pesticide use because you've ruined your soil biodiversity and you've lost the pest and disease regulation, when you add up all those other costs, it would become a less economically attractive practice. So I think the idea is to highlight the wider consequences of unsustainable land management practices in an economic sense, perhaps. So I guess that's how we would propose to deal with trade-offs, as it were. Does that make sense? I don't know if Jess wants to add.
Okay, Jess, you're not adding, I assume. Okay, thank you.
I'm not. I just unmuted. Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I was pondering trade-offs between business activities and public goods. I guess we've had a system that has only focused on delivering value in business activities and not public goods. So to move into an idea to a system that is capturing value across a wider range of benefits is moving away from the right to degrade, in a sense. But I don't necessarily see there being a conflict there. That it actually it removes that right to degrade. Does that make sense?
I think so. Thank you. I've got time for 2 more questions. So I have one here from Andrew Herbert, who says, hello, great presentation. How scalable are the models for assessing soil natural capital value between global and land management unit?
That's a good question. So I think that would depend on the model you were looking at. So, and I think potentially for similar things, so for instance, if you were looking at soil hydrology, depending on the scale you were looking at, you might use a different model. So a good question, and I think scalability in modeling studies is always something that's discussed, and how applicable the models are to different locations, how easy they are to apply. So I think, again, that could be another discussion even. But yeah, I think it would depend on the model you're using, and for what purpose. So yeah.
Great. And Jess, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that's fine. Scalability is always an issue in estimation. There are a range of models that have various scope, but I guess we'd get into a very detailed conversation, and they will be relevant to different ecosystems depending on the type of model we have there. So I guess it would come. We're not at the stage yet where we have the global unified model that is able to simulate the globe and every agricultural system, and then be scalable down to field scale for every ecosystem. So it very much depends on the context, I think, and which ecosystems are being ecosystem services are being prioritized to help narrow that conversation. But there are lots of models available, and they operate at different scales, and some of them have some flexibility to move between scales. But yeah, I'm sorry that I can't be more specific there, but it's definitely a challenge, and something that needs thinking about when applying these things in practice. Thank you for your question.
Okay, thank you. Right, so we'll just go for this last question, and can I just confirm to everybody, if your question's not been asked, it will be passed on to Jess and Victoria, and they will respond back to you. So last question is Sarah Jones. Are there any technological advances and innovations coming through that can help making agribusinesses more accountable?
Technological innovations, did you say, Anita?
technological advances and innovations. Are there any?
I guess everyone thinks of blockchain as something that might make supply chains more transparent and accountable. And certainly there's potential there for tracking practice, tracking how where products are originating from, the practices in field associated with those products. It's a huge imaginary at the moment, I guess, on the potential of that particular technological advance. That's the first one that comes to mind. I guess there may also be opportunities on the horizon in terms of remote sensing. Sensor technologies. We're probably not in danger of a huge innovation in the next few years in that space that's going to transform everything, but it's certainly on the horizon with the advances we're seeing in data science and remote observation that we may be able to get a better handle on this.
Okay, over to you, Anita.
Okay, just to say thank you then very much to everybody. Thank you so much to Victoria and Jess for the presentation and producing the report. I can see there's, from the questions that are asked, there is just huge interest in this area and a lot more we need to understand to move this whole agenda along. Thank you so much to everybody who's attended today and for those questions. As Victoria said, we'll pass those on and make sure that you can get some answers. And of course, Victoria and Jess's emails are up there on the screen. Please do contact them direct if you have any more questions. We have been videoing the presentation today and we'll put that up on the website along with videos of the other presentations on this Natural Capital webinar series. So if you've missed any of those, keep an eye on the website and we'll email people as well to let you know when those are all available if you've signed up to our mailing list. So please do go to the website and sign up to the Valuing Nature network there. Finally, a huge thank you to my colleague Victoria Barlow for arranging and hosting these events and for so ably reading out those questions and finding responses to those. So with that, we'll close. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.